January 1842. Afghanistan. 16,000 people walk out of Kabul in the dead of winter. Soldiers, wives, and children among them. 1 week later, almost all of them are dead. Not hundreds, not a few thousand. 16,000 human beings, wiped out in 7 days, in the snow, trying to escape a war their own empire started. Only a handful make it out alive. This is the story the British Empire wanted the world to forget.
Watch the horizon with me for a second. January 13th, 1842. A lookout on a fortress wall in eastern Afghanistan sees something moving on the plain below. A single horse barely staying upright. A rider slumped so low in the saddle he's almost part of the animal. They bring him through the gate. Half his skull is laid open by a sword, and the first question anyone asks him isn't, "Are you hurt?" It's, "Where is the army?" He doesn't have an answer that makes sense. Because there isn't one, he is the army. Or what's left of 16,000 people who marched out of Kabul 1 week earlier. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you'll understand exactly how an empire that hadn't lost a war in living memory lost an entire army in a single week, and why the story you've heard about how it ended isn't quite the whole truth. War Diaries presents the fall of the Army of the Indus. I'm your host, and this is War Diaries. Rewind 3 years, 1839. The British Empire in India carries a reputation built over decades. The idea that its army simply does not lose, not to regional powers, not to terrain, not to anything. When strategists grow nervous about Russian influence creeping toward Afghanistan, part of a long shadow rivalry historians would later nickname the Great Game, the fix seems obvious. Install a friendlier ruler in Kabul, back him with British bayonets, settle the matter before Russia ever gets the chance. The invasion force, nicknamed the Army of the Indus, marches in almost unopposed. Kabul falls without serious resistance. The British install their chosen king, declare the matter closed, and settle into what they expect will be a quiet, indefinite occupation of a country most of the officers involved barely understand and have little real interest in beyond its usefulness on a map. Here's what nobody in that garrison is asking themselves yet. What happens when the people you're occupying never actually agreed the matter was settled at all?
The empire that couldn't lose. An empire walked into someone else's country, put its own king on someone else's throne, and called it peace. No war fought, no resistance broken, just assumed. But peace built on someone else's silence isn't peace at all. It's a countdown. And in Kabul, that clock had already started ticking. What happens when the people watching from the shadows decide they've watched enough?
For close to 3 years, the illusion holds. British officers bring their families out. Garrison life in Kabul settles into something resembling peacetime, complete with the confidence that comes from believing a problem is already solved. It isn't. Afghan resentment has been building the entire time, quietly, underneath the routine. And in November 1841, it breaks. A senior British political officer is murdered in the streets of Kabul. His death a public statement about exactly what the occupation is worth in the eyes of the people living under it. The garrison, commanded by a general named William Elphinstone, a man even his own officers privately regard as indecisive and unwell, entirely wrong for the crisis now closing in around him, finds itself besieged in its own cantonment, cut off, running out of everything except bad options. Supplies dwindle, morale collapses. Men who spent years assuming Kabul was firmly under control now find themselves negotiating for their lives from a position of near total weakness. By January 1842, with winter closing in and no relief coming, Elphinstone does the only thing that still seems available. He negotiates. Afghan leader Akbar Khan offers safe passage out of the country in exchange for a full withdrawal. Sit with that for a second. After months of siege, betrayal, and a murdered officer, how much should anyone actually trust a safe passage promise from the same force that's been trying to kill you?
The occupation that wore out its welcome. 3 years of pretending a stolen peace was real. Then, one murder in the street, and the mask comes off completely. Families who once walked freely through Kabul are now trapped, starving, surrounded, begging the same enemy that wants them dead for a way out. And the man in charge? Too sick, too slow, too far out of his depth to save a single one of them. A promise is about to be made. It should never be trusted.
January 6th, 1842. The gates open. Picture it. Roughly 4,500 soldiers, about 700 British, the rest Indian troops of the Bengal Army, walking out alongside nearly 12,000 civilians, wives, children, servants, laborers, more than 16,000 people total, stepping into an Afghan winter on the strength of a truce with the force that just spent months trying to destroy them. It doesn't hold, not even for a day. Afghan tribal fighters, not necessarily under Akbar Khan's direct control or willing to honor a promise made over their heads, begin harrying the column almost immediately. The cold alone is lethal. Snow makes the mountain passes treacherous before a single shot is fired, and the column has barely left sight of the city walls. Look up. That's the first mistake anyone in this column makes as they enter the Kurd Kabul Pass. 5 miles of narrow ground, walled in on both sides by high rock, and every inch of that high ground already held by Afghan fighters waiting for exactly this moment. There's nowhere to take cover down here, nowhere to retreat to. Snow has already claimed dozens of lives before the first shot even lands. People simply freezing where they stand, unable to keep pace with a column that cannot afford to stop for stragglers. Then the firing starts from above into a mass of exhausted, half-frozen soldiers and civilians with no room to maneuver. Soldiers still capable of fighting try to mount a rear guard. It barely slows anything. The camp followers, nearly 3/4 of everyone in this column, carry no weapons and have no way to defend themselves at all, caught directly in a crossfire, turning a retreat into a slaughter in real time. By the time what's left of the column clears the pass, thousands are already gone, and the retreat has barely started. Here's the part that should chill you. It does not get better from here. Pass after pass, ambush after ambush. The column keeps shrinking.
5 miles. That's all Kurd Kabul Pass is. 5 miles of rock walls closing in from both sides, with death waiting on the high ground above. Thousands never make it out the other end. Not soldiers, not mothers, not children. And the column that staggers out the far side is barely a fraction of what walked in. But this isn't over. One more pass is coming. One final stand. And almost no one left standing to fight it.
January 13th, 1 week after leaving Kabul. What remains of the column, a few dozen soldiers, mostly from the 44th Regiment of Foot, makes its final stand on a snow-covered hill near a village called Gandamak. Surrounded, outnumbered beyond any hope of breaking free, offered one last time the chance to lay down arms and surrender. According to the story that survived, and we'll come back to exactly how reliable that story is, a British sergeant answers for all of them, refusing outright rather than give up. They don't survive the hill. Almost every one of them dies exactly where they stood, fighting a force that had already broken every promise made to this column since the day it left Kabul. By the time the shooting stops, the Army of the Indus, 4,500 soldiers, 12,000 civilians, more than 16,000 people, has effectively ceased to exist. Which brings us back to that lookout on the fortress wall. The rider's name was William Bryden, an assistant surgeon with the Bengal Army. An Afghan sword had caught him across the head during the retreat, a blow that should have killed him outright. It didn't for a reason almost too strange to believe. That morning, purely to block out the cold, Bryden had stuffed a magazine into his hat. The paper took most of the force of the blow. It very likely saved his life. When he reached the fortress at Jalalabad, the garrison believed in that first horrified moment that he was the only survivor of an entire 16,000-person column. For more than 180 years, that's the version of the story that stuck. One man, one horse, the end of an army. Except it isn't quite true. And that's where this story gets more interesting, not less. Here's where we do what we always do on this channel. Give you the real numbers, not the convenient ones. Bryden becoming known as the only survivor, made for an unforgettable story. Immortalized in a famous Victorian painting that still shapes how most people picture this disaster today. But the fuller record tells a slightly different tale, and it doesn't make the tragedy any less real. It just makes it more precise. Roughly 115 other British officers, soldiers, wives, and children survived as well. Not by escaping, but by being taken hostage by Akbar Khan's forces during the march, released only months later, once Britain's response made continued captivity too costly to maintain. A number of Indian sepoys also made it through on their own, separate from Bryden entirely, though their survival got a fraction of the attention his did. The army as a fighting force was still annihilated. The specific claim that exactly one person out of 16,000 survived. That's the part that doesn't hold up. Why does the distinction matter? Because a slightly less absolute story is still one of the worst disasters in British military history. It just isn't quite the single survivor myth that made it famous. And that gap between legend and record is worth remembering every time a story feels a little too perfectly tragic to be entirely true. Britain's answer came fast, and it came hard. A punitive force, remembered afterward as the Army of Retribution, marched back into Afghanistan within months, burned parts of Kabul, and secured the release of the surviving hostages before withdrawing for good. Less a victory than a face-saving exercise, a way for an empire to walk away from catastrophe with something resembling its pride intact. But the deeper lesson, that occupying a country and assuming the matter is settled is not the same as it actually being settled, never really landed. Britain returned to fight 2 more wars in Afghanistan over the following decades, in 1878 and again in 1919. Each one a fresh reminder that the terrain and the resistance that destroyed the Army of the Indus hadn't gone anywhere in the meantime. Empires, it turns out, are often much better at avenging a specific defeat than at learning from the pattern sitting directly underneath it. We've told you before why we do things this way here. History and today's conflicts told the same way, with the evidence, not the legend. This story is exactly why that matters. The clean version has one horse, one rider, one impossibly tidy ending. The real version has a mountain pass built for slaughter, a hat stuffed with paper that saved a life by pure accident, and roughly 100 survivors that history quietly wrote out to make the tragedy feel more absolute than it already was. That's the version we think you actually deserve. 16,000 people marched out of Kabul on a promise. A magazine in a hat saved the one man history remembers. And an empire that hadn't lost in living memory learned, in exactly 7 days, precisely how wrong it had been. Here's the question we can't stop thinking about, and we want your answer, not ours. If Elphinstone had refused the truce and stayed dug into Kabul instead of marching out, does the Army of the Indus survive the winter? Tell us what you think in the comments. We read every one, and it genuinely shapes what we cover next. This has been War Diaries. If you want the sides of history other channels skip past, subscribe, hit the bell, and stay close, because empires keep making this exact mistake, and we're not done finding the ones history forgot to warn you about. History forgets. War Diaries remembers.